Hi, everyone. My name is Christine. I prefer that you call me Christine, so please make sure that if you send me an email, you just call me Christine. This is an overview of Chapter 1, and so let's get started. Chapter 1 is a broad introduction to sociology, so let's take a look. First off, what is sociology? If you um, are a psych major, or you're a chemistry major, or you are a math major, engineering, etc., history major, and you tell someone that, most people say, oh, okay, they vaguely understand it if they haven't been to college, but they vaguely know, okay, I know what math is, I know what history is, etc. But when you're a soc major, there are times when you tell people you're a sociology major and they say, oh, really? What is that about? At least that's the experience I used to have as an undergraduate. The idea that people didn't really understand what it is sociology. And that might be because it is a fairly new discipline, whereas things like math and physics and chemistry, those have been around for a couple hundred years, if not longer, actually longer. Sociology really did not get its start until the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, and started in Europe. And so in the US, it's an even younger discipline. But at any rate, sociology is the study of the world around us, and particularly it is focused on how do we, as humans, how do we interact with one another in groups? It's very much focused on group behavior. Um, if you're a psych major, you know that psychology is very much focused on the individual and how the psyche may affect the behavior of an individual. For sociologists, we're very interested in how being in a group influences our behavior, even to the point where we might be in one group and we might act that way, a particular way with one group. We go into a different group and now we act a different way. So think about how the difference between how you act between when you're with your friends, when you're with family members, when you're at work, when you're in class. In each of those social environments, because there are different people and because you have different relationships with people in these different social environments, you change your behavior. And most of us aren't even aware. We just do it naturally. We learn to do this as young children. So sociology is very interdisciplinary. There are many disciplines that overlap, and sociologists uses information from these other disciplines. And so you see in this cool, colorful wheel here, we take some information from political science and economics and psych and geography, communication studies, anthro, history. There's a lot of overlap because it is a broad discipline. In fact, sociologists can study very specific things. So there's a sociology of the environment, sociology of law, sociology of, I teach a class for University of Laverne called social psychology. There we even say, we look at the effects of the socio-political or the socio-historical effects of things having happened in the past. We're looking at how society and history were integrated and how that influenced the way people acted. So very broad. Of course, an easy idea that comes to us from Howard Becker is this idea that sociologists study people doing things together, which is, as I said, true, because when we're in groups, that's when sociologists want to understand how and why do we act the way we do when we're with different groups of people in different social environments, and even from the same social environment, if different circumstances are present, how do we act when that occurs? So here's an example. Say in your group of friends, you typically act in a particular way, communicate with one another in a particular way, etc. However, if one of those friends does something, for lack of a better word, terrible to another friend within that group, then the group dynamics will become different than they typically are. Okay, and the same thing is true of any of the social groups that we're in. All right. We also, as sociologists, we're interested in all the different aspects of life. Even what some people might consider very minute details. Sociologists can be interested in them. Some sociologists focus on studying politics. Others study family. Others study drug addiction. Others study perhaps I'm kind of blanking right now, but culture. Others study anthropology and how that influences the way that we interact today. So lots of interesting topics in sociology, and you can take a lot of different higher division courses when you get to university, upper division courses when you get to university that are focused on very specific things. For example, I just saw a class for this coming semester at the University of La Verne in sociology, and it is a class entitled Racism, Anti-Racism, and Film. Okay, so again, very specific upper division course where the course is going to look at films and study racism and anti-racism and how those themes play out in movies. Let's see. All right, so I want to focus particularly on beginner's mind as well as sociological imagination. Beginner's mind is when, as the psychologist or sociologist Bernard McGrain says, it's really the opposite of an expert mind. It's the unconscious tendency that we all have to focus on or to process information based on stereotypes that we have in our heads, based upon expectations, either our own individual ones or society's expectations, the opinions of others. And we are often relying on what other people think of things, and we may be more or less receptive to different experiences based upon what other people think and say about them. So you can think a lot about how social media does a lot of influencing. In fact, all of you know that there are people on different platforms known as social influencers, right? These are people who have a large following, who post very frequently their ideas, their thoughts, their opinions, etc. And what these influencers post or celebrities post may influence the way that you think about something without even you being aware of it. It can happen. Sociological imagination. Here is a really important concept, and I hope that you are able to use this throughout the course. Let me move this down here for a bit. Okay. Sociological imagination is a concept that was created by C. Wright Mills. And C. Wright Mills was a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and I believe he came up with this in the 1940s. He was teaching undergraduate students, and what he found was that many of them were unable to move beyond what McGrain called, that I previously discussed, the beginner's mind. That is that tendency to focus on our own ideas, opinions, stereotypes, expectations. He found that these undergraduate students really had difficulty looking beyond and seeing beyond their own expectations and stereotypes, etc. So he created this concept, this idea, for how to try to train students to think like sociologists. And so the sociological imagination, you see the quote there, we must understand the intersection between biography and history. So let me delve into this more in depth. Essentially what that means is that when we are interpreting, as sociologists, when we are interpreting the world around us, when we're interpreting group interactions, what we have got to be able to do is to look beyond the quick, simple, easy, stereotypical answer as we're processing the information and really begin to try to think of how or why the other um, influences within a person's life might have created a situation where we now see a person acting in a particular way or doing particular things. So here's an example. Um, we might say that I'm trying to think of a really wealthy person. Okay, let's think of our former president, Donald Trump. Um, Wealthy man. Okay. Now, if all you do is look at the success of his businesses, you may say, well, wow, he must be really smart. Must have worked really hard, and he must have made a lot of sacrifices to be able to become that wealthy. However, oh, well, okay, so we keep that in mind. If we look at a homeless person or somebody we presume to be homeless, somebody who's sitting outside a store, say, holding a sign, um, I need money, or, please give me money, or something to that effect, or homeless, or whatever. Many people will look at that person, or at least out of their peripheral, see that person and think, this person's lazy, doesn't want to get a job, deadbeat, all kinds of negative things. However, it isn't necessarily true, the first idea about former President Trump and the second idea about the homeless person. Here's why. The fact is that our former president, Donald Trump, was born into a wealthy family. His father was a real estate, I don't want to say a maven because that would be like a female. He was a real estate executive tycoon. He had built up his fortune, and I think his grandfather before him had started building on the fortune, then he continued to build on that fortune. And so Donald Trump was born into a wealthy family. He was able to go to private schools. He went to a good college, and he had a lot of opportunities. He had the opportunity not just to get a good education, very quality education, but he had the opportunity to meet people who were already quite wealthy, who were quite successful, etc. When he graduated from college, his father gave him $1 million to start his own business. And the person who we see, who we may assume is homeless, maybe that person didn't have that kind of start. Maybe that person was born into a family that was dysfunctional. Maybe there was drug or alcohol addiction in the family, or maybe this person was in the military and suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and hasn't been treated. Maybe this person lost a job or had huge medical bills, and because of being sick, couldn't work, lost, first the car and then the apartment or the house, etc. And so the snowball effect was one in which the person ended up presumably homeless. That's what I mean by sociological imagination. If you just take the quick, easy answer, Donald Trump is successful because he's a hard worker, and because he is smart, etc., and the homeless person is homeless because they are lazy and deadbeats, etc., you really are missing a lot of key information, which might help you to understand why people are where they are in life and why they do what they do. So that's the idea of a sociological imagination, really just trying to understand how and why we get to be who we are given the social environments that we're in, and understanding that the different social environments that we are in can influence our life outcomes. Okay, that's a big part of sociology. Whatever social environments we're in, starting from birth, have a huge influence on our life outcomes. The family you're born into, the kind of education you get. These are all social institutions that most of us are a part of as we're growing up. All right, let's see. All right, so I want to focus on the three perspectives. I call them perspectives. This text calls them paradigms. Other textbooks call them schools of thought, approaches, sociological approaches. They're different words, but we're all talking about the same thing. These perspectives are you could almost think of them as different sets of glasses, like prescription glasses or sunglasses, better sunglasses, the cheap kind you get at the swap meet. So if you buy a cheap pair of yellow lenses at the swap meet, sunglasses, when you put them on, because they're cheap, everything's going to look slightly yellow. Okay, but if you buy a cheap pair of sunglasses that have blue lenses, everything's going to look slightly blue because they're cheap. They're not polarized. If you buy a pair of sunglasses that are, so I said yellow, blue, and now pink. You buy some with pink lenses, everything's going to look a little rosy. Okay, that's essentially what these three different perspectives are. It's looking at society and analyzing society from a particular view, particular perspective with these different colors of glasses on. And so let's take a look at the three. Hold on. You can read about them. I'll go back to some of these, but there we go. Here we go. Structural functionalism, or as I call it for short, functionalism or functionalist theory. Structural functionalism is focused on this idea that society is really a very ordered system of interrelated parts, right? It's, you can think of it as a bicycle wheel almost, where the bicycle wheel has a bunch of different spokes, right? Or better, my metaphor, think of a puzzle. When you first drop it out of the box, you don't see how all the pieces go together. But if you work at it, and I have to admit to you, I've never actually been able to complete a puzzle because I just don't have the patience. But if you work at it, you eventually complete the puzzle, and you see that all these little jig-jagged pieces fit together. That's society. Society's got all these different parts, right? We've got education and healthcare and law and criminal justice, and we've got politics and government. We've got social media. We've got all these different social institutions. And at first glance, it doesn't really look like they all fit together. And yet, if you look hard enough and you're patient enough, you will see that they do have a lot of overlap, that they do work together. They are interrelated. And so, of course, for sociologists that are functionalist theorists, they take the view that if something exists in society, it exists for a reason. It exists because society saw a need for it. And so society created that social institution. So you think about education. We didn't used to have the kind of very ordered educational systems that we have today. 10,000 years ago, education was the last thing on a cave person's mind. And yet, today we have very ordered systems of education throughout the world. Again, some better than others, but they're very structured and they're designed to serve a need. Functionalist theorists argue they're designed to serve the need of teaching children basic knowledge, basic skills that they will need so that they can become productive members of society when they become young adults. The same thing is true of healthcare. The healthcare systems we have today did not exist, not even in the early part of the 20th century. There was no such thing as these huge insurance companies. People went to the local doctor, who tended to be a general practitioner, who treated just about everything. And only if there was something he or she couldn't diagnose or treat, you would get sent to a specialist in perhaps a bigger city. But you paid, what you could. At least most in small towns, that's what people did. I don't know, larger cities probably you still had to pay. But now we've got these huge insurance systems, right? And so, yeah, you can go to an urgent care clinic if you don't have insurance, but you still have to pay. You've got to pay. And we've got this huge network of urgent care systems. Some of them run by CVS, others by Walgreens, some are independent, some are run by hospitals, but it's very structured, very orderly. So that's the idea of structural functionalism. Society is a set of interrelated parts. They all work together to help to keep society stable and so that society can move forward. Because if you have a lot of chaos in society, functionalist theorists say the society really cannot move forward, cannot progress. And of course, if something exists in society, it exists for a reason. It's because humans saw a need and they created that social institution. Conflict theory. Conflict theory is it's the newest, well, one of the newest of the three. It's the newest of the three, but there are some others that we're going to learn in later chapters that are even newer than conflict theory. Conflict theory really began to develop in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And it did because prior to that time period, really sociologists were largely functionalist theorists or symbolic interactionist theorists. However, if you think about what was going on in the United States in the late 50s and into the 1960s, you know there was a lot of social, for lack of a better word, social disruption. There was a civil rights movement. There were lawsuits that were filed and legislation was passed. There was a lot of turmoil as well about Vietnam, and so there's a lot of things going on, and sociologists really began to recognize that they hadn't really spent a lot of time questioning how and why certain things were happening in society. And so for conflict theorists, they believe very strongly that there's this constant tension between the group who have the wealth, the power, and the opportunities and prestige, and those who don't. And that there's this constant tension between these two groups, and that at times, that tension will become so strong that there will be some societal chaos, or at least, to some degree, some sort of pushback from those who do not have the power, the wealth, the resources, and the opportunities. And so they see that societies in their view, societies in this constant tug of war between those who have the resources, the money, the power, etc., who don't want to give it up, they don't want to share, and those who don't. And sometimes, we go along and there's not a whole lot going on between these two groups. And sometimes it gets more tense and then there's a lot going on and then it kind of dies down again. That's what conflict theorists say is a natural part of society, this natural tension between those who have and those who do not. Symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism is very much, it's the micro perspective of sociology, because the other two are macro perspectives, are focused big picture. Symbolic interactionism is focused on more minute, much more focused areas. And so for symbolic interactionist theorists, they really are interested in how within groups we communicate, we interact with one another, and how we give meaning to things such as gestures and facial expressions and body language, etc. And also how meanings and values and ideas and opinions are created through the social interaction we have within these groups. Okay, so I want to take us through this quickly here. I'm going to use education because I started out using education to think about structural functionalism. So I already explained how for functionalist theorists, they view education, something that society saw a need for, and slowly but surely a social institution of education was created. And we see it around the world, right? And it's designed to serve a very specific purpose of teaching children the skills, the knowledge, and also not just the skills, but the social skills that they'll need to go out into the world and contribute to society. Well, for conflict theorists, they view education as, they're not saying that none of that's true, but when they look at education, the system of education, they're much more critical. Right? They're willing to look at things that functionalist theorists don't necessarily want to see. They're willing to see the bad, and they're willing to call it out. And so for a conflict theorist, looking at our educational system, we'll just focus on K through 12, focusing on our K through 12 educational system in the United States, particularly right now, and right now, I'm talking about 2022, early 2022, there's a lot going on in education right now, in particular in certain states with regard to banning certain books from the curriculum. Okay, and so, but to be honest with you, that this is not the first time that has happened, where school boards and parents got together and decided, you know what, we don't want children to read this book, or we don't want them to read that book. It shouldn't be part of the curriculum. That's happened probably since the beginning of the creation of educational systems. If you've ever read Huckleberry Finn, which is supposedly a classic, which I must admit I never read in school. It probably was banned when I was in school, which is maybe why I didn't read it. But Huckleberry Finn, which was written by Mark Twain, was at one point banned from many school districts in the United States because it used the N-word. Okay. Right now, there's a book. It's a graphic comic novel, and it won some awards in 1992. It's called Maus, M-A-U-S. Maus is German for mouse, you know, the little thing that runs around. That has been banned recently by school districts, particularly in the South, because the argument is that it's too graphic, right? It's a graphic novel. Well, of course it's graphic. It depicts, the author tells the story of his family who were they were in the Jewish concentration camps, and they escaped, and then they came to the United States, and this is the story this person wrote of his family's history. And eventually here, his mother, she made it through the Holocaust, but she ends up killing herself, committing suicide in a bathtub, and his father finds the mother in the bathtub. And of course, this is a comic book, but it is depicted. And so it's been banned because people think, well, geez, you know, this is way too graphic. Conflict theorists, though, look at something like this and they ask the question, well, wait a minute. Aren't there other things that can be just as graphic that children are exposed to in school that are not banned? And who does the banning, and why do they do the banning? And usually it's the people in power who are trying to impose their views, their opinions, their ideas, their way of doing things on the people who don't have the power. That's really the focus of conflict theory, just looking at how is power used in society, who's using it, how is it being used, who is it benefiting, and who is being disadvantaged by the use of that power. Okay? And we'll see a lot of that in every chapter because these three paradigms are used in every chapter, and so we'll use them. Symbolic interactionist theory. Symbolic interactionism, as I said, focused on the minute, the interactions, right, within a group. Those others were broad. So if we think about a classroom, a symbolic interactionist theorist is going to be considering, how do teachers interact with their students? For example, do teachers interact with male students differently than they do with female students? And how about the students? What is their interaction like? Do female students interact with each other one way, but differently when they are interacting with males? Do male students interact with each other one way, but differently when they interact with female students? And if we're thinking about the classroom, then we also wonder, okay, so how do the norms and the values of a classroom, how do those develop? Does the teacher impose all of them? Does the teacher ask the students for input into what they will all agree or will be the classroom etiquette? All of those things are very interesting to symbolic interactionist theorists. Okay, so I hope that you see how, with just looking at one social institution, education, you can use each of those three perspectives to understand that system, that social institution, from different views, right? Each of them have a slightly different take on the same social institution. All right, so now let me go back really quickly to a couple of the important, well, they're all important in chapter 1, so read about all of them, but these are individuals that you will hear about because their theories appear throughout the text. So Emile Durkheim, his name is Emile, not Emily, Emile Durkheim. Emil Durkheim was very important to sociology because he very much helped to establish sociology as an academic discipline. Prior to his study, he did a study in 1897 called Suicide, where he focused on the relationship between social isolation and suicide at the macro level, right? Looking at it at the society level, not at the individual level, but at the society level. How are the social environments within society? How do those influence someone to the point where that person may take his or her own life? And there's a good discussion in the text about his study, so make sure that you read it. But essentially, he found that there are two main factors in suicide. One is social integration, which in his view, he explained it as how integrated you are with other people, how connected are you to other people, do you have a support system of people that you can count on, and social isolation. Do you not have that social support network? He also wondered about social regulation. How much does society regulate someone? Does it have an extreme hold on you? Does it oppress you? Think about slavery in the United States and around the world when it was in existence. Slavery was very oppressive for people who were slaves. And for Durkheim, when he talked about regulation, that would be extreme regulation because you don't have much choice in life about what to do. Or you someone who has a lot of opportunities and you can do whatever you want for the most part. And that would be, at least during his time when he was looking at this study, that would be white men who had property and money. And so we see that today this is still relevant because we still have people who have a lot of wealth and power and opportunities and resources and people who don't. We still have people who are oppressed by the way that society operates. And I'm thinking here about policing and the numbers of Black men who are stopped by police, and all too often that interaction ends tragically. If not tragically, then at least not very in a very nice way for the African American male. And then you've got people who have a lot of wealth and power and money, and they might be cut some slack simply because of who they are. And so those two factors, you'll see in his study that he postulated how they play a role. So he's important, and we'll see him again. He was a functionalist theorist, by the way. Karl Marx. Karl Marx, conflict theory is based upon a lot of the writings of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher and very much a political activist during his time. And he was really focused on social inequality. By the way, Marx lived from 1818 to 1883. So he was writing a lot of his work during the industrializing period in Europe. And so he focused on how capitalism really seemed to him to create a lot of inequality. And he actually, in many ways, I think, viewed capitalism as the root of all evil. Right? I think he might have even written that in one of his books. I read some of his books in college. So focused on social inequality, and in his view, part of the problem, the big part of the problem was capitalism, because capitalism enabled certain individuals to become what in French are known as the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, loosely translated, means people who have the wealth, the money, the power, the means of production, and the land, the resources, the gold, the silver, the mines and all that kind of stuff, and the proletariat. These are the people who are the masses, the workers. There was a middle group called the petite bourgeoisie, but he didn't really think they were too much of a problem because petite in French is small, so small business owner, people who work for themselves. The proletariat, of course, were the ones who were being exploited, in Marx's view, by the bourgeoisie, And Marx believed very strongly that at some point the proletariat would figure out that they had something that the bourgeoisie did not. That was numbers. There were a lot more workers than there were the bourgeoisie. And he believed that at one point the proletariat would rise up against the bourgeoisie and overthrow the capitalist system. Of course, that didn't happen in the way that he thought, but he really, his work, his writings are really a large foundation for conflict theory. And Max Weber. Max Weber, again, you'll hear throughout the semester about some of his theories, still very relevant today. Weber, it's pronounced with a V because he was German. Max Weber was someone who was very interested in, again, he's also living during the industrializing period in Europe. And so he's interested in how industrialization of society, of the means of production, of creating goods and services, how does that affect society? He was concerned that there was a lot of development of what he called rationalization, which is when we try to order all human activity. We try to make it as efficient as possible. And of course, for Weber, he was a strong believer that modern societies were becoming more and more bureaucratized because there was this perceived need to become much more efficient, much more goal-oriented, and that, of course, required more rules. Right? So if you think about prior to the industrializing period, people lived in agrarian societies. People lived on small plots of land that they either rented from a landowner and produced food and then paid the landowner for rental of the land, or if they were very fortunate, they owned a small plot of land and they farmed and produced livestock, etc., not only for themselves but also for sale. And if we're thinking further back, not in the U.S. but in Europe, they may have been serfs, which meant that they worked the land of a large landowner who then required that they pay something in terms of food or goods or something, so that they paid their way. But you can't do that anymore. Once things start to become industrialized and people start moving into cities, you've got to have a much more regulated way of processing information, processing things such as birth certificates, etc. And so for Weber, he was very much focused on studying how this industrialization and this rationalization of societies around the world were really starting to change the way that people interacted with one another, and how the norms and the values were changing because of these two factors. All right, so I will just finish up, I think, here with Erving Goffman. Erving Goffman was a more recent sociologist. Goffman was a symbolic interactionist, and he was very much focused on, again, how we interact with one another, how being in different social groups changes the focus or the way that we interact with others. One of his key ideas that's still very useful today is called dramaturgy. It's very similar to something Shakespeare wrote, I don't know, about 500 years or so ago. Shakespeare once wrote that the world is all a stage and we are merely actors in it. What did he mean by that? Well, Shakespeare meant that when we go out into the world, we're acting. We're not truly who we are. We interact with others according to, and this is Goffman now, Goffman argues we go out into the world and we interact with others essentially using a script. It's a loosely written script, but it's essentially a script that tells us how to act in different certain social institutions or social environments. So we go to school, there's a script for that. How to be in a class, how to be on campus. We go to work, there's another script. We're with our family, there's another script. We go on our first date, there's another script. We go to church, temple, synagogue, there's another script. That we have these scripts and they're in our heads and they essentially tell us how we're supposed to act. Do we all do it all the time? No. We all tweak it to our own individual um, personalities and characters, but we largely use those scripts. And so at times we may use these scripts more than others, and that just depends upon the social group that we're in and also what our goals are. So we'll see more of Goffman's ideas as we go through the semester. I think that is where I will finish up today. There are a couple, well, I'll just really quickly do these three. These are some newer theories, and we'll see them later in chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, and 16, I believe. Feminist theory, a much newer set of sociological theory. In fact, feminist theory is in political science, in anthropology, it's in history. I mean, it's a political, it's not only a sociological paradigm. It is a way of viewing or studying something from the perspective that inequalities within society tend to be structured around gender and how males and females are viewed within a particular society. So feminist theory in history, for example, looks at how women have played a role within society, even though throughout most of human history, women have been considered subordinate to men. Anthropology, feminist theorist anthropologists would look at how women played a role in helping to develop and create the culture, the early cultures that existed, and how women today still help to shape the cultures that we see today. For us as sociologists, when we look at society from a feminist perspective, we are looking at how gender is viewed by society, what that means, the meaning of it within society, as well as how those inequalities, because of whether someone is X, Y, Z, M, whatever, how those inequalities influence that person's life and how they interact with others. Critical race theory, another newer theory. By the way, feminist theory really starting in the 1960s and really probably reaching its apex in the 90s, still very valid today. Critical race theory, again, starting largely in the 1960s and by the 90s, really taking hold in just about every discipline to some extent. For critical race theory, theorists, again, in history, there are critical race theorists, psychology, sociology, etc. The focus here in sociology is how race, racism, power, how those things influence the experience of people within various social institutions. And again, we'll take a look at that in chapter 8. And finally, queer theory. Queer theory, the newest of these later theories, taking shape really starting in the 1970s and again becoming much more widespread by the 90s. For queer theorists, and again, queer theory in history, in psych, in anthropology, etc. For us as sociologists, when we look at society, queer theorists are really focusing on how sexual identity and the social construct of sexual identity, how we think about whether somebody is trans or heterosexual or bisexual or lesbian or gay. How does the sexual identity of a person, how does that, the meaning within society of being in one of these groups, how does that influence or impact a person's outcomes within society, and how are some of the meanings around these different categories, how has that changed over time? And why has it changed? And what has that meant then for people in these various categories? So that's it for the Chapter 1 overview. I will see you for the Chapter 3 overview. And please make sure you do all the reading in the chapter because inquisitive is based on the reading in the chapter, and of course, so are the quizzes. But also, I do these just to give you a broad overview. My intent is not to go over every single PowerPoint because some of it is very well explained in the text. So with that, I'll say see you later.